But power on the left is deceptive.
Collapsing on the core. We will continue to follow the data.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The vaccines work well enough that the virus stops with every vaccinated person.
We are particularly interested in your background. I mean, you have this Polish ancestry. You grew up in Canada. You come from a Polish family that's very interesting. And as I just discovered, he has an ancestor who was a colleague of Louis Pasteur. So I think that's just an interesting starting point. If you would you tell us about your family?
Absolutely. I don't get a chance to talk about this very often, so it's quite remarkable. So Otto Bojvid, my great-great-grandfather, he was, you could think of him as a Renaissance man, and he was the first Polish vaccinologist. He trained under Louis Pasteur in Paris and, brought the technology to Poland and built the first, the way it translates is, I guess, a vaccine factory. I don't know if you call it that or not in English normally, but yeah, and the whole family was very deeply involved in this, actually. And so him and his wife was kind of an infamous member of Polish society, Kazimiera Klimontowicz. There's actually in Krakow right now, there's an annual award given in her name, because basically what they did was they built the first girls' high school in Poland. They were very big on men and equality for men and women, especially in education, which wasn't the case. And there's this really interesting anecdote from his memoirs where Marie Curie, whose name was Skłodowska, right before, a lot of people don't know that. Of course, she was Polish. She had just, finished up her studies at the Sorbonne, I believe it was, and she had come to Poland and she wanted to get a professorship in Poland because she was a huge patriot, right? And no university would take her. And she was part of what you would call a salon back in the day, right? And she was lamenting this, right? And eventually, of course, went to the Sorbonne, and the rest is history, 2 Nobel Prizes and so forth. But it's sad, right? It could have been in Poland if Poland had been a little more thoughtful about letting a very distinguished a woman professor in. So to make a long story short, that actually inspired them further to actually start the school and so forth. Yeah.
And it was pure gender discrimination.
It was because right. A lot of the world was like this at the time, right? And simply they just said, no, you're a woman. You can't. And they're like, well, I'm doing better work than you are. I mean, I don't know if she said that. She might have thought that, right? But so she ended up doing her work in France because they let her, and not in Poland at the time.
Tell us about the cascade of family members and the interface with medicine and
sweat.
Well, okay, so I mean, it's actually quite interesting because their daughters, they had 4 daughters, and the daughters were all, as it would happen, kind of first. I think one was the first, I believe, female surgeon in Poland. Another one was, a first in military officer, I guess, or something. I mean, maybe not the absolute first, but among them. Okay, we tend to, in families, we tend to embellish these things sometimes. So I don't want to be so completely definitive. But they're basically, and one of them became took over the business, right? The vaccine business and so forth. And there's actually a really interesting, and the other one was actually my great grandmother. But in this vaccine business, what happens? So World War II happens, right, along the way. And so the Germans, as they, kind of take over, this is all happening in Krakow. That's where that part of the family is from. They kind of, because of Otto Bojvid's work in the past, they kind of respect him. So he was actually able to kind of first get a bunch of people out of Auschwitz, out of the camp, like some of the more of the Polish prisoners. But the other thing was that in that factory, what they actually created was a way to basically, once, they realize this final solution is actually something that's being implemented. They would have a thing where in one door, someone, that traditional looking Jew, would walk in, and out the other door came out a person that looked nothing like them because they had been shaved. They had put in Gentile clothing and, try to go out into society. So there's this whole kind of the factory turned into a different kind of factory, kind of an operation to save people from this. which I'm very, very proud to know that this was part of the kind of family legacy.
When it started with the very first vaccinologist in your family, roughly what time period and what organism were they fighting?
Oh, you know what? I don't actually know right at the moment. I don't remember what that first vaccine was. I wish I could answer that question. Do you want me to try to look it up?
Well, it would have been Pasteur's early work, and I think he was initially interested in some of these they didn't know about viruses. So it would have been these bacterium in the late 1880s. Pasteur was a guy that took a crack at rabies. That was one of his first big, and that's a terrifying story, although it's quite a digression. A real quick question: was your family at all affected by the Cotton Massacre? Do you know if any of your family members were affected by that?
I don't think any close family were affected by it, but there is, for example, from that side of the family as well, I have a great uncle. And this is actually very interesting because you remember this part of the world, the borders keep changing all the time, right? I mean, Poland didn't exist for 120 odd years, right? At one point, Prussia, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire divided. So they were my family was kind of mostly in the south, which is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the sort of the least repressive part. They basically give us the money, give us the taxes, and we'll leave you alone, do your thing. The other places they were actively trying to destroy Polish culture. But so this great uncle of mine, basically he had was part of the underground, was part of the Polish underground, and got caught with a cache of weapons and so forth. And they were going to kill him. They were going to, this is what happens. They're sentenced him to death. But he had a cousin in Germany who came over and said, basically made arrangements. And this guy, I've also learned, was actually an anti-Nazi, and he did some very interesting work. But he wasn't openly, at least initially, openly against the regime, because that would have had you knocked out. But anyway, he came over and he said, "Look, I can get you out, but you have to renounce your Polish citizenship, right? You have to just renounce your Polishness." And the guy said, "No, I will never do that." And they killed him, and that's the story, right? This is also it's a powerful story because it speaks to what patriotism meant to people, back in those days. He wasn't going to do it, even though he knew that he'd have to pay the ultimate price for that. It's kind of incredible. So there were a lot of the family members, basically neither the Nazis, the Germans, nor the Russians, or Soviets, they never, Bolsheviks, none of them liked my family very much because they were always doing things that were, even there's a sort of a group of the family that ended up in France, kind of a long story, but they were basically already fighting against the Tsar back in the day, right? For a free Poland, right? In the Russian part of Poland before World War I.
You guys at the Epoch Times, you're oftentimes trying to warn the world of the dangers of these highly ideological totalitarian regimes. Do you think your Polish ancestry and the struggles of Poland against totalitarianism is in some way informed your worldview?
I mean, 100%, right? I mean, I grew up with learning about these stories. Here's the thing that I've realized, okay, and this I realized some years ago, but it's incredibly difficult for someone who does not grow up in a authoritarian or totalitarian society, and there's a distinction, we can discuss that as well, but to understand what it's like to be in an authoritarian, you just don't get it. If you're in a free society like we have been for quite some time here and in Canada, you don't think to yourself, I have to censor what I'm saying. I don't think, well, Peter is clearly, someone is asking Peter to report on me, right? So I have to edit what I say, and if maybe I trust Peter a bit, so I have to speak in a little bit of code. Maybe I can get some code back to see if we're really on the same team or not. And it just completely, when in Poland, when they had this process, lustracja, right, after communism fell, where they said we're gonna let the dossiers, in communist societies, everyone has a dossier. Like the system, the state security has a file on you, on every person, right? And or on many people, right? So you could go out and see your file, right? This was part of their sort of trying to get out of communism, right? And people discovered, this is a very Catholic country. Pretty much, most people went to church, to confession. All these priests were reporting on what people were confessing to the state security. Wives were reporting on husbands, and you can even imagine scenarios, right, where state security invites a wife in, they're interested in the husband, and they're like, look, my associate over there, he's hanging out with your kids right now. I'd like to know what you have to say about your husband. So what do you do, right? What do you say when you know that these guys have got your kids? They might do something bad. Now you have to report on your husband. And this is, I'll just mention this, right? This is actually how this system works. These communist totalitarian systems work. They function to try to compromise your moral high ground, right? So it's always these types of situations like I just described. There's no win situation. Either you betray your husband or you betray or you're forced to, maybe some harm will come to your kids. What do you do? Well, whatever you do, in the end, you're somehow diminished afterwards. And this is through these years that I've been studying this system and so forth. This is a kind of, it's not as they say, it's a feature, not a bug, right, of how the system works, because you can control a population which doesn't feel like it has a moral high ground largely is much easier to control. So now I've deviated a little bit from your question, but
you know what's come to my mind in that description of how resource intensive this is. Totalitarianism or authoritarianism, I hope you can separate those two for us. How resource intensive it is. Really? There's government agencies talking to every family, trying to divide and snitch and getting people to snitch on each other. I've lived here my entire country, my whole life in America. I've never had a government agent come and talk to me about my wife. Can you imagine how many families there are in these countries? I mean, but this is a resource-intensive effort to do this.
I submit that it's just become more efficient in the last couple of years.
Well, yeah, it is. But what I'm saying, John, is we grew up in the 60s and 70s. There weren't government agents coming over and talking to our parents.
Of course, but think about it, Doc. They were talking to the head of this government apparatus, which is more diffuse. They were talking some way. There was some communique with your formal. I'm going to refer to it as your former hospital system administration.
I know.
That's what we're worried about.
The reason why we're talking about this is we are in the era of American totalitarianism.
Right.
We're in it now.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is to do it, it's resource intensive. So whatever's going on now, who's ever writing the AI for Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and who's ever pulling the trigger. I talked to a doctor last night where the Department of Justice knocked on her door. And she's a physician dissident. She's not going along with the COVID narrative. Well, someone paid money to pay for an airfare to have a DOJ person come out and knock on her door and kind of talk to her. My point is, John, what you're describing going on in history is resource intensive, meaning there must be a lot of people on the side of oppression.
Yeah, and so you raise a really interesting point, right? I've been thinking a lot about China lately. Of course, Epoch Times, where we have this origin deeply connected with the Chinese regime. The Chinese Americans trying to tell the truth about that regime. Not a lot of people were listening at the beginning of that, but it was very important information. You can look at that system, and if we're not careful, if we don't do our work to fight for freedom, right? I feel like we could end up like that. But there's the distance. I just want to be clear, the distance between that and what we have here, even today, as we see, different very troubling structures forming and being implemented, is still quite different. It's still quite a distance. And then we can certainly talk about that, like how big that distance is. It's sizable. But the point is that if we could end up there, actually. We could end up there, and it's a terrible, terrible reality. And we even have these, recently I saw this interview with the head of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, kind of, talking about how a lot of countries sort of admire, I don't remember the exact words, but he was saying they kind of admire they see China as a kind of a model for the future. that's a terrible thing. I mean, if maybe if you're in that top elite, you might want to live there. But even then, the things that you have to do to other human beings to keep that position are frankly unthinkable. This is not a good system. The system, is designed to corrupt the human soul, right? Who wants to live in a country like that, even if you have all the riches of the world, at your disposal? I don't get it.
Well, I wonder if you could talk about, there would have been a kind of a natural sympathy that caused you to pay attention to these Chinese dissidents in the United States. So there's something like a sympathy there. Maybe you could talk about how you then found yourself talking with these guys.
This is one of these funny things. I grew up with this lore in my family about biologists. Actually, one of my great-grandfather was the dean of biology at the Jekielek. I just kept hearing about it. Biology. There were all these doctors and so forth. Now I'll never go into biology. I was very contrarian, right? Ever. Of course, I went into biology. And, I ended up studying evolutionary biology and in Madagascar. And I did my field site. I was studying lemurs. And the last time I got back to the lab at the University of Alberta where I was studying, that year I started getting very kind of ill, and I didn't really realize what was going on. I was very tired. Sort of things start working. I started getting double vision, and then just my body stopped really working very well. And it was hurting my work quite a bit. I stopped really being able to do my lab work very well. And eventually just something happened, and I checked myself into the university hospital, and they diagnosed me with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And Guillain-Barré, or as it's typically called, or GBS, is familiar to maybe some of the viewers of your podcast because it's associated with many kind of vaccine harm. It's commonly, or not commonly, but one of the things that can happen. And it's your immune system goes haywire and attacks your peripheral nervous system. And some of the symptoms are what I just described. And it killed my career. I still tried to teach because I was able to kind of do that. It wasn't like one of these terrible cases where people die because their lungs, they can't use their lungs anymore. But yeah, so I was trying to figure out what to do. And I started looking for alternative therapies because there was no treatment for this. Except in very severe cases. I think they had plasmapheresis or something, but I wasn't a case like that. So I started looking, and I met a guy who had chronic fatigue syndrome, and just a guy that I knew from a coffee shop. Where have you been? Oh, okay. And he told me that he had recovered from it using this type of Chinese meditation. And I didn't really know anything about Chinese meditation. I said, I'll try anything. I was very open. My mother was into alternative things. I was trying them. It wasn't working. So I tried it. And and the meditation, by the way, was Falun Gong meditation. And so this is, most people have heard about this because of the persecution in China. I didn't even really know about that. I was very focused on my biology, but I started doing this meditation, what you think of classically as meditation, but also these slow exercises, kind of like Tai Chi. And I started feeling better. So I just kept doing it. And, within about a month or two, I went to see my neurologist, and I didn't fully grasp what had happened, but she told me, no, you're in complete remission. Something's happened. Keep doing what you're doing. I have no explanation. You don't need to see me anymore. And it was just kind of an amazing moment. And it really kind of changed my life profoundly because, when you're in this sort of situation, when you're faced with your mortality, I was like, God, if I make it through, I'll do better. I'll actually, what I said was I'll dedicate my life to service. That was my commitment that I made. Right. And I thought after all this happened, I thought this is serious business, right? I have to make good on this. So, no, and then, at the University of Alberta, there was a postdoc whose mother had just come over from China. And this woman had been tortured in terrible ways. Terrible ways. And why? Because she refused to sign a piece of paper that said, I renounce Falun Gong. Can you imagine? They tortured this woman to try to get her to sign a piece of paper. And if she had just signed this piece of paper, she could walk away. And this just blew my mind because in a civilized free society, what is that? That's not, there's no justice in that. And everything I had been hearing from my mom and my father and just over the years, I just crystallized from it. My God, this is, I get what's happening here, right? And I thought, I have to help these people.
Resource intensive. It takes effort to torture somebody, some lady with a piece of paper. It takes effort to do that. That's what I'm getting out of this interview. That, of course, it's not feasible long-term, this totalitarianism, because there's no efficiency in it. It is resource-intensive. You've got to have a lot of people doing a lot of bad things to other people to make it work.
There were estimates. I mean, I don't remember who made them because it's been so long, but there were estimates that some really massive portion. So I'll just add something. It happened. It's an interesting day to be talking about this, right? Because today, Jiang Zemin, who is the dictator of China prior to Hu Jintao, who was the dictator prior to Xi Jinping now, died at the age of 96. And he single-handedly actually initiated this persecution of Falun Gong practitioners against, from what we learned, most of the advice from his advisors, because this was a huge problem. This was 70 to 100 million people by government estimates that were doing this practice, completely innocuously, basically, right? And he kind of forced it through, and there's a lot of theories as to why he felt like he needed to do that. But to get back to your point about the resource intensity, there was an estimate that something like a third of the resources of the whole country at the time were committed to persecuting these people, because it's like 70 to 100 million people. The strategy, this is the translation, was bankrupt them, destroy them physically, destroy their reputations, bankrupt them financially. That's how it translated.
Big government. We hear that word all the time. I'm against big government, what have you. Well, that's the epitome of big government, is like an operation like the Chinese Communist Party, right? Isn't that big government?
It's about as big government as it gets, where the entire society is part of. Well, the party is higher than the government. See, so in this case, the party basically takes the entirety of the government and the society and everything in its service. So imagine, pick a political party in the U.S. Imagine they were able to assume complete control over the entirety of society and the military and all of it, and use it in their own design, in their own service. That's what it is.
So through everything, through churches, through community organizations,
exactly,
through families, through factories, right? So help us understand the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
Well, so this is actually, I'll make a reference here, because there's a really excellent, recently written, there's a lot of books that have been written over the years, but there's a recent book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Matthias Desmet, who I believe you're familiar with it. I think your name is on maybe the dust jacket of that book, if I recall correctly. But he outlines this extremely well, looking back at history. But the major difference is in authoritarian societies, there's this kind of, the system basically structures things in such a way that you have to be obedient or you will be crushed, so to speak. Okay, that is a very, very simplistic explanation. In a totalitarian state, which is a relatively modern phenomenon connected to mass, and I think Desmet builds on a lot of past research on this to kind of explain this well. There's this segment of society that is deeply committed to the system. And it's not necessarily a massive segment. It could be, 10, 20, 30 something percent of the population, but they kind of deeply believe in it. And I'll share just a very interesting anecdote. So I had a young man named he's not that young, Konstantin Kisin, on the American Thought Leaders the other month, and when he told me this very interesting, he's a Russian Jew that was sent to England to grow up when his parents saw that things were going bad after communism fell. And he has this observation. So upon Stalin's death, and it's funny that we're talking about the death of a dictator because one died today, but upon Stalin's death, his successor, Khrushchev, right, basically said, he gave this very long, detailed speech. I believe it was 2 hours, explaining essentially the bad things that Stalin had done. And prior to this, Stalin had been deified in the population. And this speech went out to every Communist Party cell. It wasn't to the general population, just the Communist Party cells. And remember, this is the time of the Gulag, right? So, there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Russians involved in persecuting even larger numbers of Russians, in many cases to death in horrific ways in these gulags, right? And so, but what he basically said, Stalin was bad, Stalin was wrong. And what happened after this was there was this spate of suicides of these people who had been in the Gulag system, who had participated. The thing was that some of them actually believed. It kind of broke the spell of this, mass formation, as Matthias Desmond calls it. They thought they were doing good by doing horrible things to people somehow, right? And this is somewhat baffling to me. There's theory as to how this happens. And then they realized, oh my God, I was doing horrible things, and they started committing suicide. In some cases, these people were living side by side with the people that they persecuted. This is how these societies, kind of work. So, that's the foundational difference.
So authoritarianism is in a sense, a philosophy or an operating system that says, do as we say or we'll crush you. Totalitarianism is it the implementation of it, or it's...
It has to do with the use of mass media, right? I think these smaller variants of this have happened in history, and this is what Desmond describes. But I think in the modern sort of bigger structure, like, say, Nazi Germany, which is another great example, in the Soviet Union, right? Just because of the incessant propaganda, total control of the messaging of the system, it's sort of, there's some portion of the population, this is what I believe, is somehow susceptible to this, to start, believing whatever that megaphone, as I call it, says, and somehow allow themselves to do terrible things in the surface of that propaganda and ideology. And, we saw that in Nazi Germany. Like, this is a situation where, the whole society was on board for what happened. It's not like it was the Nazis and, the Germans weren't involved. No, the Germans were involved. And they've been trying to figure out how to deal with that reality. And in the Soviet Union, it was the same situation.
I think that was Khrushchev's famous cult of personality speech about Stalin. I mean, I think that's the translation into, like, this guy created a cult of personality that was highly corrupting of our society. And then this did kind of cause people, like the trance, for a lot of the people that were participating, then they're sort of snapped out of it. But it reminds me of some of the documents you see of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where these students are suddenly on board to do this collective kind of crazy ideological, fanatical, extreme ideological stuff, informing on their own parents, going to the police and saying, I was just in the kitchen with my mother while she was cooking dinner, and I heard her crack a joke about the local commissar. And then they would, before the boy's eyes, haul his mama out of the kitchen and put her up against... And I actually saw a document in which this guy, he visit this. Well, this was the scenario. He informed on his mom. They jerked her out of the kitchen, put her up against a tree, and shot her. And then now he's snapped out of the trance, and he can't believe what he did. And his desire for repentance is so strong that he visits his mother's grave every day and begs for her forgiveness. So this snapping out of the trance, that's another element of this. But the resource and intensiveness, it's marshaling all of these participants. And do you remember this document that we saw the other day about the COVID Community Corps?
Yeah. April 1st, 2021 is a White House, Department of Health and Human Services initiative to funnel a massive amount of money, over $13 billion, to organizations to push vaccination. So it's a government bribe to push COVID-19 vaccination, and the money went to the American College of Pediatrics. Before the vaccines were even approved for children, it went to the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology to push vaccines on pregnant women. It went to virtually every church, every community, Hispanic and Black groups. It went to the NFL and sports teams, went to Hollywood and entertainment. This is a government program. You know, people have been in this current controversy have been basically vilifying the pharmaceutical companies. Oh, it's big pharma. It's big pharma. They're doing the dastardly deed. Well, wait a minute. This is in the open. This is the U.S. government and pharma combined in their power of pushing products on the country.
And there's this really interesting element. This is the part that I find very difficult to sort of tease apart. And there's a lot of debate and sometimes very lively debate about this, right? Which we've discussed. But, you know, a lot of people deeply believe, you know, despite all the evidence that we have that this is that you know, there needs to be a serious reassessment of these genetic vaccines. You know, that's a good, nice way of putting it. They just deeply believe against all odds that this is the right thing to do, that this mass vaccination is the right thing. And because this is also what was, and I think this is where the mass media play, and these types of structures that you're describing play a role. But I also think that those people that are pushing those structures are themselves in the formation. Like, well, you know what I mean?
You know, how this all ties together is the power of the collective. The power of the collective. The reason why that person snitched on his mom is that he felt the power of everyone being together on this, the collective, was much more important than her individualistic comment on something. People believe the power of mass vaccination, the collective, we're all in it together, let's all take a vaccine. This collectivism there has a power to it. It is a cohesive driving force. I've been to China 5 times, and I tell you, that's the feeling I always get when I talk to my Chinese colleagues, mainly doctors, but I talk to other people, is that the power of the collective. In fact, one time a Chinese doctor told me, he explained to me, there's a word in Chinese, you may know it, I don't. He said, but it's a word that describes the danger of confusion, of commotion, of individuals going in different directions. There's a danger in doing this. And he says the reason why it's such a big thing in China is because we have such a big population. And if we were all going in different directions, if we were all very individualistic, this place would be total chaos. And what he imparted to me was the collective, the collectivism leads to order, and order itself leads to a better life. And that's the belief system that they have.
I mean, this reminds me of the famous story of Socrates. So we in the West, we think, well, where does this idea of the individual come from? Why have we placed such a premium on the individual in Western civilization? I mean, not always. I mean, after all, a lot of these totalitarian systems originated in the minds of European intellectuals. So there's always been a tension. But I think that the trial of Socrates is interesting because he was this free-thinking guy. He was a real kind of smart ass. He would go to dinner parties and ask questions that would sort of confuse everybody. He had a very funny sense of humor. But his idea was, whatever you think is the reality of life and politics, and you're probably wrong. So you always have to be questioning everything, the eternal questioning. Then along comes the Peloponnesian War. It goes the wrong way. The Athenians start losing. It gets very stressful. Then this weird plague comes, which we should talk about sometime. It's like, okay, enough of these individualistic guys. Like this situation is spiraling out of control. We're probably going to lose this war. This could go really chaotic. So get rid of the questioning guy. So these kind of trumped up charges of impiety and this sort of thing. But this is the tension.
Well, we have one more definition I really want you to help us with, and that's fascism. Mm-hmm. What is it, and how does it relate to the other two?
It's funny, the term that comes to my mind immediately when you say fascism is, I think, a public-private partnership. I don't
Which,
think
to me, that sounds like a good word.
I don't think that all private-public partnership is fascism by any means, but it's basically, corporate entities being used for as part of the sort of the state mission, and there's this kind of integration that happens. I mean, this is what we saw in Mussolini's Italy. Pardon me. But it's very much a collectivist. To use the term that you were using, very much a collectivist way of viewing the world. Basically, the individual is subservient to the collective need.
Right, but fascism, the government and private organizations or companies becoming intertwined, where the private company becomes a state actor.
Well, they're accountable. They basically work on behalf of the state. Yeah.
I mean, you doctors are always talking about fascia, the things that bind. So it's the fasces, or there's an old, going back to ancient Rome. If you were a member of the priestly class, you would carry it's like a bundle of sticks, and it was bound together with like leather thongs, and those leather thongs in Latin are called fasces. And so it's the symbolism is we're bound together. And I think the early theoreticians of fascism, they were Italians, and we think of Mussolini and Hitler in public parades, but these guys were writing books, and they had the idea that corporate law could be subsumed into a top-down structure, so that you're actually making corporations and the state almost indivisible. But this works very well. There's a temptation to this kind of fascistic partnership now because we don't have any fiscal discipline. The governments can just create as much money as they want. It's just like, oh, we need another $2 trillion for the latest misadventure. And so if you are a well-positioned corporation with lobbyists, you're friends with these guys. So there's a kind of a natural temptation to get into bed together. We have an emergency. We'll create $2 trillion overnight, and we'll give you the money because you're making a messenger RNA vaccine or whatever it is you're in the business of doing as our friend. So I think I'm glad that you brought this up, Doc, because I think we almost, without really being aware of it, we are kind of naturally trending back into this fascist corporatism. I mean, doesn't it seem that way to you?
I think one example I think of what you're talking about is this sort of, tight coordination around messaging of, government, big pharma, and big tech around all sorts of things related to COVID, especially this mass vaccination. Without, just sort of as if everybody, and the really weird thing when you look at these emails, that conversations between people from these different, parts of society, it's like they're all, this is what struck me, okay? They seem like they're all assumed to be on the same team.
Oh, there's a great example of that.
It's fascinating, right? Like, it's just, you would expect there'd be debate about these crazy society-changing things, right? But it's not. It's like they're all like, yeah, of course we're going to do this.
Well, how could the message be the same phrase? So in the summer of 2021, it was on the news in every station, every news station, every late-night talk show. It came out simultaneously, crisis of the unvaccinated. And everyone parroted that word. I was on Fox News that week, and we showed a montage. Even Ron DeSantis said, we have a crisis of the unvaccinated. Everyone used the same phrase. This has happened multiple times now, where it's almost the propaganda technique, John, is flood the zone, right? So a message is crafted, and somehow it gets out, and simultaneously the zone is flooded.
I mean, well, you're a media man. You would know. I mean, doesn't it kind of feel like a script is being distributed to newsrooms?
The whole thing is bizarre. I mean, there's these amazing montages. You may want to pull them up of hundreds of different newscasters basically saying the same line. This will be very dangerous for our democracy. I can't remember. That's one of them, I think. But so there's definitely that sort of thing is happening. Like actually, like here's what we're gonna all say. But I think what you're talking about is just when you really saturate the megaphone, as I call it, right, with the same message, we just kind of imbibe it at some level. Like it's not unless you're incredibly skeptical and resistant to it, or very clear that you don't want to be listening to that. You might just even start saying it.
It works.
But
you're a news guy.
Yeah.
You're at the news desk. You're at your computer. Are you getting a memo to say crisis on the unvaccinated?
I'll tell you something. I'm not getting any memos like this. Okay. I mean, so our tagline, right? Is
you have a firewall or something? I have to tell you,
it's their mission. I mean,
truth and tradition, right? I mean, we're very serious about it. So you asked me earlier about sort of giving you a bit of more of the origins, right? Why don't I do that now? Because it's kind of an opportune time. But so going back to China, I was working with Chinese dissidents. There was this underground railroad from through Thailand, basically from China through the Golden Triangle into Thailand to get them refugee status. Very dangerous area of the world, as you're both aware. And we were, there was always this danger of people being repatriated back to China, especially like the Falun Gong dissidents, for example. They were unusual refugees. They would go to the Chinese embassy in Bangkok and protest, stop murdering people, that kind of thing. And so the Chinese would try to pressure the Thais to send them back. It was this constant situation where there was just a lot of people in danger. So we were working on that, and I saw these amazing stories. Some people walked through Vietnam, down through there, and I wanted to tell these stories. So I started under a pseudonym, basically contributing to the Epoch Times and so forth, and just they liked what we did. My wife was also working on she actually reported, if you recall, there was a tsunami in off the coast of Thailand in Phuket. She went down there, that was some of the first reporting she did for the Epoch Times. And and by 2009 we basically we both started working with the Canadian edition and doing that internationally, both in the US and elsewhere. But I loved the idea. I loved the idea of working with a media that was going to be honest about China, because at the time this was kind of the Kissinger doctrine. Okay, back in, I think it was 2007 or 2009, Thomas Friedman, remember in the New York Times, he wrote an op-ed. It made me crazy. He wrote that we should adopt Chinese governance practices here in America. That was, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was wild stuff. And I knew at this time I had already done some of the original early reporting on forced organ harvesting, on this murder for organs industry, right, in China. It's like, no, we do not want to adopt those governance practices. This is like the worst, right? But somehow people would kind of gloss over these, obvious crimes against humanity and not want to know about it. And then there's this other element, right, in these, just as human beings, we don't want to believe. And I still find this today as I learn about the next terrible thing that I didn't know about, that I just don't want to believe that human beings are capable of doing such things.
Have you ever read the China Daily News?
Sure.
I mean, I think anybody, I've always told my friends and family, if you're going to go somewhere, even if you don't want to go there, I think everybody should go to China and everybody should go to India, for the reason of understanding the enormity of these countries. And just sit in a hotel in China and pick up a copy of the China Daily News. And I can tell you, as an American, this would be the type of story to be in the China Daily News. There was a monsoon that hit the coast of China, and the Chinese government swiftly evacuated 6 million people overnight without any difficulties. It would be like, what? I mean, that's like removing an entire state of people in the United States. Like, how does that happen? How do they write that? How do people actually believe that? There was another story about, in the United States at the time, there was contamination of heparin, which is a blood thinner that we use. Mm-hmm. It was coming from China. And there was a storyline that the quality of Chinese products have been reviewed, and without question, there are no difficulties whatsoever. And whatever, and they just and you could pick up the China Daily News, which was assuring complete safety of their products in the United States. There were people being, getting toxicities from heparin. And the dog food, and you can go on and on. But the idea of just writing things that are completely impossible to physically evacuate 6 million people overnight.
And Peter, demanding that people believe it. That's the other part. The expectation that the system has, right? This is the part that I almost find even more troubling. Like, people kind of know, a lot of people kind of know this is not true, right? But the expectation and what you're supposed to pretend to your friends, oh yeah, of course it's true, because
I have to ask you about pretending. Do you remember when the previous leader of North Korea died, and there were newsreels of women just wailing in tears and what have you? It was just an unbelievable emotional waterfall of tears. In my mind, I did think, are they faking it? Or is it real? Is the lament real, or is this part of it? Do you have to fake it?
You told that story about the Russian, what ended up being a Russian, someone who gotten his mother killed essentially by ratting on her, right? And I know a North Korean essentially identical example of this. This was a guy, and just this is actually worth explaining. So in North Korea, if you are found out to be a dissident, the entire family goes into a concentration camp and lives there for several generations. Okay, that's the punishment, right? So this guy actually was born in one of these concentration camps. His mother did something untoward, and he just told them, look, she did this untoward, and they shot her in the head in front of him. That's what he lived through. Eventually, he kind of saw through this escape. I mean, it's almost impossible to escape, right? But there are these people that have done it. An unbelievable story of Yeonmi Park, who I had on American Thought Leaders. I mean, it's worth that's an amazing book to read about North Korea. But the point is that some people are so deeply conditioned, so deeply believe in these systems that they would lament exactly like you described. They absolutely mean it, and they would just point out their mother for doing the wrong thing. And I mean, there's no closer bond, right? Is there in humanity than the mother-child bond, right? And no problem. So that's the power of this indoctrination or mass formation. I don't know. I'm just trying to kind of understand how well this works, frankly. I don't know exactly how it works, but it's deeply disturbing.
So in Matthias Desmet, his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, what he writes about, this, in a sense, this trance, this mental state that occurs, in your independent assessment and reporting, do you see elements of truth in what he's saying?
Oh, no, I recommend this book to people these days.
I do the same. The reason why I wrote one of the inside cover comments is I see this behavior now in my colleagues, doctors, particularly around COVID. And the two aspects of COVID, the failure to treat it early and also the vaccines. I see it in them. My friends who I knew for decades now, I see almost a blank stare. I see almost this willingness to say, listen, it's over with. Any type of friendship that we had in the past, it's over with. We're not communicating anymore. There is now, there's a new normal. There is a team of promoting fear, suffering, hospitalization, and death, non-treatment, horrible things going on in the hospital. And there is a clear agenda to promote these vaccines. And it is so fundamentally clear.
And there's this other element that's very interesting. Something, I don't know if you've read Joe Ladapo's recent book. It's very worth reading. A lot of it is a compendium of his, writings throughout the pandemic. It's amazing how much integrity he has had throughout it. That's the sense I get. But one thing he mentions in there is that the way that doctors are taught about vaccines is very different than any other intervention, as I understand it. I mean, doctors are told that vaccines transform the world. They're incredible. And there's this sense that they're kind of infallible almost. And he says this is how we are taught. So what I feel is there's a lot of building blocks. Like, why is it vaccine? It's very interesting to me that something that a lot of people would say is a gene therapy was called a vaccine. Because it puts it into this completely different class of health intervention, right? Which is this, this special class that somehow has very different regulatory requirements, that has, and has this aura around it of infallibility and this kind of protection. I mean, you know a lot more about this than I do, frankly, but I find that fascinating.
I think that starting with Jenner in England, who came up with the first smallpox vaccine, very, very primitive vaccine, but just the idea to inoculate. So it's not you get the disease and I, as a physician, will do my best to manage it. I, with my singular intellect and enlightened view of nature and understanding, will intervene in nature to prevent you from getting the illness to begin with. And I think starting with Jenner and certainly going up to Pasteur, and then where you really see it is just the glory that was bestowed upon Jonas Salk. It's like, this is a genius. This is, the Olympus of medical procedure, where you just prevent it from happening altogether. And I think that intersects with concepts of religious protection. I mean, you even in ancient people, that you'd have the talisman, or there were certain symbols, there were certain rituals that would just protect you from evil altogether. It's not that you're touched by evil and have a contest with evil and then hopefully come out. It just protects you from evil altogether.
So vaccines make you less vulnerable. They make you stronger against your enemy, which is the pathogen. And they really work if everybody does it. So vaccines are one of the ultimate drivers of collectivism.
Oh, fascinating.
That is the cohesive thing. That's even better than a belief system. That's even better than sharing money. That's better than all the concepts we've talked about, because together we become stronger against our enemy, and our enemy is the next pathogen that comes, and you can see how this would drive the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization and Gates Foundation and all their creations, Wellcome Trust and Rockefeller Foundation. They are fighting a common enemy. There is a common enemy to the world, and we will save humanity. Peter Hotez, down at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, has come up with a vaccine. It hasn't saved a single life yet, and he's already been nominated for a Nobel Prize. I mean, these are stunning observations when you think about it. There's something transformative about the vaccines. I was privileged to write the back cover of Joe Ladapo's book, and Joe is a very interesting case study. I don't think I've ever seen a public figure in office, as he is, the Surgeon General of Florida, give such a deep disclosure about his childhood. And what type of intellectual courage does it take to disclose child sexual abuse? That's extraordinary. And I think the word of the day, certainly the word of our book, is courage. It's having the intellectual courage to be a dissident through all these different genres we've talked about, Jan, takes tremendous courage, right? Courage to the point of potentially losing one's life.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because, this is what, kind of got me into journalism in the first place, is covering people who literally, would put their lives on the line for their faith, right? And then just kind of watching our own systems, here in the West, starting to look more and more like those in communist China. There was this whole idea, by the way, the Kissinger doctrine is also, a lot of the people that told me I believed in it. I believed in, the free trade to China, allowing, by the way, the biggest coup for Jiang Zemin, I'll just mention it once, was getting China into the World Trade Organization. They have never fulfilled any of the requirements to this day, and they were able to grow like crazy because of this, because they played by a different set of rules, right? This was kind of Jiang's legacy, right? Why did he grow so quickly? Why did he helped the country grow so quickly was on the backs of, free countries. But I'll never forget, maybe it was in 2015, 2016, I noticed this sort of the Western media, what we call the mainstream, I call it the legacy media, starting to talk very much in the same voice with the same talking points, kind of like what we talked about. It wasn't the exact same words, but it was the exact same message. And I had become used to this because I'd been reading things like the China Daily, right? You have to read these propaganda pieces because you need to know what the regime is thinking, right? Or what they're trying to promulgate, right? And I noticed that our own legacy media were starting to behave like it just struck me one day. Oh my goodness!
What is the government coordination with the mainstream media in the United States? What is the mechanism of how that happens?
The truth is, I don't actually really know. Right? There's a few different pieces. There's these financial incentives, of course, right? But that's kind of a more modern phenomenon. But I think there's an ideological. I think. In the bureaucracies and sort of the permanent bureaucracy of the government, I think it attracts people who tend to like more top-down control type systems, right?
But it seems to me there has to be some type of messaging. The example that comes up in my mind is, remember the Boston Marathon and the two brothers? The older brother, there's a massive manhunt. They're using every camera in Boston to try to ID these guys in their backpack and how they did it. The older brother has a wife. They quickly figure out who he is and who the wife is. And somebody in the press gets out to the house and they get some type of quick interview with the wife, like what happened, and she's astonished that her husband could possibly do such a heinous thing. And then after that, nothing. There was not a single mention of her ever again. As if every time this was purported, it was never mentioned that he was married. It was never mentioned that he had a wife. No one was pursuing the lead because she, knew probably where he was going. It was as if someone said, ice this, whatever you do, this woman will not come up in any single report. I think because the investigator said, listen, quit contaminating this. We need to use her for information to get this guy. But I thought to myself, listen, there's 4,000 news rooms across the United States, all the local news stations, all the syndicated stations. How did they ice this? How did they ice it where not a single reporter would even mention the older guy has a wife? It was astonishing.
Yeah.
I mean, with military affairs, like with these foreign adventures, like with Iraq, I thought it was remarkable how all of our newspapers of record just took the exact same position on it. And one thing that I've heard is that you can't get close to Department of Defense people. You can't get close to CIA people. They won't let you in and give you information if you don't stick with their messaging. It's like, oh, well, you might have an independent view of it, but the first column that you print, you've just lost access.
People always ask me, so how are you funded? And I didn't, initially when people start asking me this question, I didn't fully grasp it. But, a lot of media and other organizations are actually funded by people with agendas. It's very interesting. In our case, I don't know if lucky is the right term, but we've evolved in such a way, and partially we were forced into it by basically, getting deplatformed off of some social media where we had, very robust presences and campaigns and so forth and advertising. But, we're mostly supported by individual subscribers, and it's actually a very powerful, in very significant portion. We have some larger donors. We're a 501c3. We're a nonprofit, but it allows us to be genuinely independent. There is no big funder. Because the big funder always has an influence. Obviously, everybody knows that, right? We just don't have that. So we can kind of, find our way and of course our vision is truth and tradition. I mentioned that before. We're always going to have this, sort of this angle, and I think we're very transparent about that. But I think there's a huge open field for truth-seeking journalism right now. I want to kind of encourage people. We want more competition. Why? It's just so weird. This is a weird thing to me, right? I almost feel a little bit embarrassed that part of our success is because so many people just gave up on doing proper journalism, that we're supposed to be the carriers of that flame, right?
Have you ever been a guest on a podcast before?
on a very rarely. I rarely do it, but
what does it feel like when you're getting peppered with questions as opposed to the opposite?
I'm someone who likes to really think through things before I speak. So I think I'm probably not the best guest. I think, the sort of the more exciting guests are the ones that'll just, basically be able to talk off the top of their head, give their analyses. For me, I really, before I commit to an idea, especially an analysis, I really have to think about it. I just want, actually, something else that's happening. I want to mention this because I know we're going to be finishing up soon, but is there in China right now, and this is very relevant, right? There's unprecedented levels of protests. It's the biggest protests in 30 years. It's since Tiananmen Square, since the student movement and the Tiananmen Square massacre that ended in the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's amazing. And, there's a few things that are very interesting that I noticed, okay? Number one is a lot of the people in these photos and videos are actually unmasked. Okay, and this is, in Asia, there's much more of a culture of masking. It's much more of people would wear them to not infect others when they're sick with the flu or whatever. But these people, it seems like this zero COVID policy that they've been forcibly implementing. I can tell you why. It's bizarre that they would do this, right? Because it's terrible for the economy. It seems like terribly repressive. Why would they do this? But is really been kind of the last straw in a series of repression initiatives against people. And so my concern about it is that the authorities up to now seem to be unusually restrained. It's funny. It's a concern, and it's like I'm cautiously happy and I'm cautiously concerned, because cautiously happy, one of the theories is that people are just basically the police and so forth. They're kind of on board, so they don't really want to repress the protesters. But the other theory, which makes me concerned, is like, no, this system is pretty happy to repress and do the most terrible things you can imagine to people. So, and this is actually a totalitarian, technocratic totalitarian state where everybody's phone is monitored. Everyone has these vaccine passports, red or green. Every movement is monitored. So they're gathering an insane amount of data right now on all the people who are going to, be upstarts, who are going to basically say no, who aren't going to wear the mask, who are not going to wear the hazmat suit. God, this is crazy, right? So this is where we are. It's a very, and then now we have the death of Jiang Zemin, which always has very significant potential for instability.
Well, could it be, listen, get everybody on camera, let's get it documented, and then let's crush them?
Well, and this is what they call this is what Mao did pre this technology, 1,000 Flowers Bloom, movement, invited people to come out and say what they had to say and then culled them all.
Now you've identified yourselves. Thanks so much for joining us. I have this romantic idea of Krakow circa 1880. It's a beautiful aristocratic salon with Chopin playing, and we're having a very civilized. I feel there's something old world about you. I really do. We're so pleased with the Epoch Times. You guys really are the guys who are telling the truth or trying as hard as you can. So this has been a real pleasure. Is there anything that you would like to conclude with?
Well, why don't I just, tell people where, you can find us. TheEpochTimes.com, of course, is our main website. I have a show called American Thought Leaders where you two gentlemen have actually appeared together. So this is really a turning of the tables. I hadn't thought of that until this particular moment. So I'd encourage people to look that up on the Epoch Times and Epoch TV, which is our streaming platform. And and we are in some very interesting times, and I believe deeply that the truth will prevail. The truth has to prevail, and we have to keep encouraging others to seek the truth and speak the truth as much as possible. So that's my wish for all of the audience.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jan. It was a real pleasure.
Pleasure.
Yeah, great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.